He would snap me in half, and I would thank him for it.
Welcome to Breakfast at the Beanery, a bi-weekly podcast about superheroes. I'm Becca.
I'm Mika, and we're glad you're joining us as we break down our latest superhero obsessions. Check us out at Beanery on Twitter, at Breakfast Beanery on Instagram, breakfastbeanery.tumblr.com, and of course, breakfastbeanery.com for updates and more episodes. Okay, so season 2 of The Punisher premiered at the beginning of 2019, and this was at the tail end of the Netflix Marvel original series run, with other shows already being canceled. So The Punisher was one of the last ones to get canceled, next to Jessica Jones, which left a pretty sour taste in our mouths to begin with. We just finished a rewatch of season 2, so while this episode touches on a few things from season 1, we're going to be focusing on the second season. And as always, we are going to be full of spoilers.
So, The Punisher Season 1 follows Frank Castle, an ex-Marine whose family was murdered before his eyes. He swore to get revenge on everyone involved, which made for a very enticing plot in Daredevil's second season. In the first season of The Punisher, Frank learns that he didn't have all the answers surrounding his family's death and works with new allies, Dina Madani and David Lieberman, to destroy the men that ruined his life, including his own best friend, Billy Russo. They end the first season with a gruesome fight. Billy shoots Dina in the head, and Frank leaves Billy with a mangled face and hopes that when he looks at it in the mirror, he'll remember what he did. Dina sets Frank up with a ticket out of town so he can live anonymously, which is where we start with him in the first episode of season 2.
Yeah, so the second season introduces Amy Bendix, a young girl caught in the middle of a political scandal. When assassins come to take her life, Frank protects her and helps her through to safety over the course of the season. We see Dina struggling with her trauma from season 1. She's unable to let go of Billy Russo, who has been in the hospital with amnesia, and his therapist, Krista Dumont, helps him to cope, and when he escapes from custody, he turns up at her doorstep for help. And whether we like it or not, that's the love story of the season. And by the end of the season and series, unfortunately, Frank sends Amy off to Florida, Billy is put out of his misery, and Dina is living her best life, leaving Frank as the Punisher. Dun dun dun.
It's been over a year since the finale, but people want more. It may not be as large as some campaigns, but the demand for season 3 is real. So check out the Save Punisher hashtag or savepunisher.com if you want to join the campaign to bring the show back.
And of course, we don't just have campaigns for the show's return. With the rise of out-of-context accounts, what kind of friend would I be if I didn't plug the out-of-context Castle account that somebody started earlier this year? So follow at OOC_Castle if you, like me, are still trying to fill the void left behind by the end of Season 2, Episode 11.
I'm trying my very best to keep up with that account. Now, with that plug out of the way...
That's what she said.
We're unfortunately going to have to skip the best of Twitterature this week, if only because we have so many thoughts, which you will hear
after our snack break. But this week, I snacked a lot on Japanese cheesecake. There was a lot of cake, because it was my birthday. I'm pretty sure there's still a little bit of cake left.
I saw you had, several types of cakes, which I wanted so bad. I've mostly been snacking on chips this week. I have some now, but because we are recording, I'm not going to eat them. You would hear a very strong crunch.
I left my tea upstairs, but I have been consuming a lot of chameleons. They help me to calm down from my very apparent anxiety.
The chameleons.
Yeah.
Well, you'll definitely need to calm down in a second as we get into our analysis.
Yep. So here we are, the analysis section, which, you know what that means, Editor Mika.
I am going to try very hard not to ramble.
And I have faith in you. So, I guess we're going to start off with the season's strong points. I found that Amy Bendix is the light of my life. She has this heart that fleshes out her quips and banter with Frank, which might otherwise feel kind of, I guess, tropey or flat, but that's so not the case. One of my favorite moments is when Frank is talking about Lisa, his daughter, and you can see the yearning in Amy's eyes as she makes lighthearted comments about what could have been. She's always watching Frank, and in turn, Frank is always watching her back.
She's honestly one of the stronger secondary characters. Like, she gets deeply invested in Frank's life, as you said with that conversation. If Karen is a parallel to Maria in season 1, which we saw when Frank had told David that she's family, immediately after David had talked about his wife, then Amy is definitely a parallel to his children. There's a lot of overlaps with how he speaks about his children and how he speaks about Amy. They're examples of him, Karen and Amy, are examples of him trying to move forward.
Yeah, so speaking of moving forward, Dina Madani plays a huge role this season. She's not quite as unhinged as, let's say, Frank or Billy, but her anger and desire to expose Billy's true nature is sort of a weird anchor this season. I kind of missed her having these positive relationships, though, outside of Frank. It was cool to see her interact with Curtis, but I really wish that she got to heal with like an actual support system of her own.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, her relationship with Sam last season was obviously really significant, and the loss of that still stings, but it would have been really nice to have her genuinely connect with someone other than Krista.
And I don't think we can even say that she and Krista had anything genuine. So that's unfortunate because it leaves her feeling pretty isolated in that sense. I remember the first time that I watched The Punisher, I wasn't that attached to Dina, maybe because I still suffer at times from internalized misogyny. She spends most of the show angry and hurting in this steady, painful way. The thing about season 2 is that she, Frank, and Billy are all falling parallel to each other. The narrative always links them, and while Frank distances himself from Billy, Dina is constantly intimately involved with him in her efforts to move forward from her trauma, caused by him, sadly. My only frustration is that the season wrapped it up in a neat little bow, so we don't actually see much of her post-Billy. I just want to see her happy.
Yeah, she absolutely deserved a third season.
We all did. Another highlight of the season, the show, really, is Ben Barnes. I mean, Billy Russo.
I mean, you mean Ben Barnes. I truly honestly believe that he invented acting this season. Billy's command of his expressions and just his persona in season 1 is, of course, shattered. You get it? Because Frank, smashes his face into the mirror.
We got
shattered.
it.
Okay, by season 2, and it was like watching the Lord make an onion. Layers on layers on layers.
He's so good. I've said it before and I'll say it again. This may have been his best role. Mm-hmm. I believe he said this in an interview, but I don't know where. But he made the call to humanize Billy in season 2 by drawing on his fears and his loneliness and making him emotional or cry where the script wanted anger.
Yeah, so on the one hand, we have him coldly execute fellow veterans after this heist goes to hell. And then on the other, when he breaks and has these vulnerable moments of confusion and hurt and anger as a response to his trauma, you can really just see a hurting kid.
Billy remains really complex for that reason. Because unlike other characters that lack empathy in this universe, specifically like the Netflix Marvel universe, he actually seems to care sometimes. Like this non-empathetic but somewhat empathetic character, which I think can be a little messy, but for the most part it still feels strong and not like flimsy writing. He invests a lot in other people, but you can see where it comes from a narcissistic place. He just wants to be wanted. I definitely had issues with him and his story this season, but I still loved his scenes a lot.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of his best moments were kind of lost to that terrible plot. So speaking of, are we going to go for the bad parts of the show now?
We might as well. We gotta get there. Krista Dumont, dare I say, the Lee Thompson of Marvel, the Punisher. Is that fair?
Yep. Ding, 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 ding.
I actually wanted to like Krista. I remember when we saw her the first time around, I thought it was such a good idea to include therapy as part of Billy's story. But therapists in media are often discredited through plot lines like this one, where she sleeps with her client and ultimately throws away all of her work, all of her years and years and years of school and work and motivations for love, question mark. I feel like that it's not as well thought out as it could be, so it takes away from the character and from the relationship. I remember telling you that it felt reminiscent of Barbara Keane's plotline in Gotham Season 1. But the difference here is that we don't really feel or see that manipulation linger with her. And Krista's a licensed criminal therapist. She worked with Billy for like a year, but she made that flip for kind of a flimsy reason, and it like cut to between episodes. She ended one episode like not okay with it, and then started the other one perfectly okay with it.
Yeah.
It just wasn't compelling, and it was the only romance we had to root for this season since Karen couldn't be there because of Daredevil.
Yeah, so I didn't think that they were gonna go there. So when they started phase 2 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and we started getting films like Captain America, the Winter Soldier, or even in Iron Man 3, where they sort of touched on that, so with Steve's depression and his discussions with Natasha and Sam, as well as Tony's panic attacks, I remember that I wanted more material that did that, where it explored heroes, villains, anti-heroes, and their mental health. So seeing that they brought in like an actual therapist for the show was really exciting, but then when they crossed that threshold into, oh, this is now like a romantic sexual relationship, it just felt like it fetishized and like discredited like everything leading up to it. They could have had a really captivating relationship that dived into his mental state more, which I thought, because of Ben's acting choices, was so like well done and superb, but then it felt watered down by this quote unquote love story. And I felt that once they crossed that line, Krista's characterization became really sloppy.
It was very sloppy. It was hard to figure her out, especially because like they had this childhood trauma for her, and they had this relationship with her father that they would like touch on, but it felt so it felt very unexplored, and in that way it felt kind of gratuitous and just in the same way that it was with Barbara saying that she had this darkness in her out of nowhere. It just felt like it was there for the plot, for Billy's plot, not for her own plot.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, they were kind of setting her up to be the next sort of villain in the subsequent season. But then it would have still centered entirely on Billy as a sort of, like vengeance for him. You just said something that reminded me of Gotham even more. Oh, the fight between her and Dina that results in her death.
Yes.
Reminded me a lot of the fight at the end of season 1 between Lee and Barbara, where it's like, great, did I really want to see this?
Right.
Like, it's cool to see like the choreography sometimes, but it was also just kind of like, I don't know if I wanted this. Like, two women fighting, like they weren't fighting for Jim or for Billy, but they were fighting, I guess, because I don't know, it just felt like
I get what
weird.
you're saying.
Yeah, it just felt off.
It's like orchestrated that way because of Billy existing. It's just like weird.
Yeah, and like it just sucks again that Dina's only real scenes where she's fully vulnerable are with her, when obviously Krista's not on her side. And then I know we're going to touch on this later, but then when we cut to the end of the season where Dina's like fully happy and well adjusted, it just doesn't there's like this disconnect where it's like, where is the healing though?
I was gonna say that for Dina, like, not having anybody, we didn't even have any scenes with Rafi or like her parents. Like in season 1, we at least had that. We had some scenes with I don't know, the woman whose name I forget. In the that she like works with or whatever.
Marion. Marion something.
We had a few scenes with her, but I don't feel like they were very significant. And obviously she's not a character that I personally attach to. So
Yeah, and she doesn't even have like the same, because they meet like last season too.
Yeah.
And so they don't have the rapport that I feel like they really integrated Rafi's connection to her family like really well in the first season, where you could just, it wasn't like told to you, you just knew that they were family friends, and that kind of brought a new layer to their relationship. And then Dina didn't really have that this season. Like she was mostly affiliated with Frank's connections, which there's not enough time in the world in one episode to truly dive into the mess of Krista and Billy. But before we get into Frank Castle himself, I did want to touch a little bit on a few other characters. We already sort of touched on Dina, and I did mention how she and Curtis would interact. So I guess I'll use that now and say that I really wish that Curtis had his own storyline. He definitely deserved a plotline where it didn't center on his 2 angry white boy friends. And honestly, like, because he himself sees himself as a bridge between these 2 characters, and we know that he's a healer, it would have been really cool to see like a trinity. It's instead of this Bill and Frank dichotomy, we get more of Curtis's story for most of the season. I guess moving on now, because I thought of the interaction between him and the Pilgrim. I thought that the Pilgrim / John / Robert / what is your name? I thought he was a weak villain because they were clearly setting him up to be a parallel to Frank in that, he's gonna lose his family in a sort of way. But we don't actually see him interact positively with anybody, really, aside from that one scene, I think towards the beginning of the season, with his wife who's dying. And because we don't see him really interact positively with anybody, and I guess positively is not the right word, but more like intimately with anyone, he kind of feels like a caricature. Like, he's like the preachy, like a literal preachy bad guy. Until the very end, of course, because in the last few episodes, when we see him like crumble, there were instances where I felt more investment, and then I kind of wish that they had gone more with that like complexity. But then even then, there were some interesting inconsistencies on the writer's part.
Like there's a scene in, I don't remember, it's like 4 episodes from the end or something. It's near the end when he started like crumbling when his wife dies. Where the writers dedicate several minutes to him explaining that he was racist before, but there's and I just like thought of this, but there's no turning point for him to not be racist. like his wife died, so he's just not going to be racist anymore. Like it doesn't make any sense narratively. I guess they're trying to paint him as like he's seeing the light, so to speak, about the environment that he had lived in, and how they're racist, and like he's like, I'm not like that now, but it doesn't, there's nothing within the narrative for him throughout that really shows that he was to begin with. So now he just is because he is, I guess. That said, John really felt the most captivating at the end. Like we said, it's just, he kind of felt like he never needed to be a villain in the first place, which maybe the flaw of that is why they created him that way anyway. The plot itself hinges on some like weak homophobia, and the Christian cult just wasn't really that, I don't know, original. captivating. I don't know. It wasn't a very strong point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear that?
I can.
Let me fix that really quick and I'll jump back into this.
Okay.
Buddy. Go away. Sorry, that was my cat. So what was I saying? Okay, so the plot hinges on the weak homophobia. And if it weren't for Amy, I don't think we'd feel any kind of connection to that storyline.
Yeah.
I know I said this when we were watching, but the Christian cult stereotype they're playing off of feels kind of bland, especially because they know how to work Catholicism really well into Daredevil. And I know it's not the same writers.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's certain things that aren't really painted as thoughtfully. Not to sit here and be like, all Christians are good people, because that's not true. But I think that this particular instance, using the homophobia and the racism as a plot device was
Yeah.
It just didn't really land. And like I said, Amy was the better part of that plot.
Mm-hmm.
I like seeing how Curtis started exploring his own wounds halfway through the season, to tie it back to him. There were a few times where he decided not to listen to Frank, which is a big move for him, because in season 1, that's all he does is be the support for both him and Billy. That, unfortunately, ends up being guilted by the narrative for making those decisions, both by Frank and by the general direction of the plot. I think some of these shows like to punish characters for trying to take control of their own destiny and find their own agency because something bad happens. I mean, that's maybe out of their control, and they get blamed for it in story. But there's no I feel like there's no support there. So he is trying to find his own way, and then something bad happens parallel to him finding his own way. So he's like, I guess I can't do that anymore. It's unfortunate that that's the direction they went with Curtis. And I think that in season 3, it would be cool to see Curtis moving forward too. Whether that's with Frank still as his closest friend, or if that's him kind of stepping away and finding something on his own.
Falling in love.
Yeah, I guess.
With the girl he lied to.
Maybe not with her.
Did we get a follow-through on that? I thought that they were gonna set that up. Now that I think about it, I'm like, he lied to her about the rats. So wait, why didn't she appear again?
She felt like such a throwaway, because they were just like, we're gonna show that he's trying to do his own thing, and didn't actually put any weight into it. It's the same thing they did in the first episode with Frank and Beth. Is they're like, look, we're setting up this thing that he clearly cares about, but it's there's no passion in it, which just isn't like Frank. So speaking of, let's break down Frank Castle.
Literally. I'm kidding.
No, let's not do that.
He would snap me in half, and I would thank him for it.
I'm sorry. I thought of the ones that are step on me, daddy. That's what I thought of.
I mean, are we wrong? Anyways,
no.
With that thirst out of the way, largely, I think this season for Frank felt like a sandwich with really moldy buns, because the first and last episodes made some odd, and by odd I mean kind of awful choices. So yeah, we mentioned her, but he sleeps with Beth, the bartender, in the season premiere, and it just felt so wildly out of character because he could barely handle being kissed by Sarah Lieberman last season, and that was not even I guess an authentic sort of, I don't want to say authentic, but their connection was sort of created by the need to protect the Liebermans in the first place, because David couldn't be there for the family, so Frank stepped in as good old Pete. And Beth felt like a stand-in for both Maria and Karen. And I think just in general, in the first episode, he just felt like an entirely different person. And I can't really nail that on anything else. It just felt inconsistent with everything that we've seen.
Some of how he talked.
Yeah, especially with how he reacted after they slept together, where he offered to have breakfast with her and her son. It just felt... And then the final episode, we end with Frank at his lowest point, although I feel like not enough people recognize that this is a low point. So he gathers 2 gangs and he's virtually accepted his role as the Punisher, except throughout the entirety of season 2, we see him getting called out by all his friends for his methods, his behavior, and we see him grapple with how he was made to believe that he murdered 3 innocent women towards the very end of the season. So when we see him push away everybody, especially Karen, and then the way that the show frames it is sort of like a cool Punisher scene at the end, it just felt off. And I think that if we did have a 3rd season, it wouldn't have felt as wild, because then maybe we'd get more context, hopefully. But that, unfortunately, is not the world that we live in.
Thanks, Netflix.
Yeah, thank you.
I like the moldy buns metaphor. It just feels very appropriate. I know that one of the things that bothered me in that first episode is how he's like in bed with her and like doesn't name drop Karen, so to speak, but quote drops her.
Yeah.
And I'm like, so you are thinking about this person that you clearly have like romantic feelings for, but won't be serious with. But then later on in the season, he's like tells Curtis that he was trying to move on with Beth. It's a very weird thing that they're doing, that it doesn't feel very complex and thought out. Much like the trajectory we see in Daredevil, I imagine that season 3 of The Punisher would have allowed Frank to kind of climb out of this hole that he's dug for himself, because you're right, he's at a very low point. It's the goal for Frank, in my opinion, was never to be the Punisher. He distances himself from the name. He never wanted to be put into this role. If not for his family dying, he wouldn't have. It's not like Matt, who kind of sees Daredevil as his calling, and especially sees it as his identity solely in season 3. Frank is the Punisher because he has to be, because whether he likes it or not, he wants to help the people that can't help themselves. But this doesn't have to mean that he demolishes 2 nameless gangs for the hell of it, which is exactly how they painted that last scene. And we can't really assume that that's not what he's doing. Frank has always been a very focused character. His motives, his desires, his restraint is always very calculated. This is why his relationship with Karen, for example, is so impactful, because every tender moment with her is like perfectly distant, even when he's risking everything to keep her safe. But where Frank is patient, he's also stubborn. He's like a glacier moving at the slowest pace, and without anyone there to push him forward to help him out of that mindset, he stagnates. And you see that in the hospital scene in episode 11, when like Karen leans forward and she's like, "You're not a monster, you didn't do it," and she's like happy for him, and everybody, like Dina's in there trying to reaffirm that for him, because he won't hear it himself unless people are like telling him that, because he's so stuck in this mindset. So without those people, he stagnates, and we see everyone important, sans David, sadly, push Frank to give a shit about himself and to embrace Frank Castle and not the Punisher. But because he's this stubborn, calculated person, he pushes them out. I would think that he's scared. He's afraid to, as you know, Karen would say, to love people. And he's just not in a good place. So to take the end of season 2 and assume he's in this badass, cool position is really a disservice to his character. Also, damn, we didn't get enough Karen scenes this season. I could do an entire episode on that. For the same reason I raged when watching season 3 of Daredevil, it makes no sense narratively that Karen would be that absent from this story, especially when half of it's in New York. If not for real-world conflicts, I feel like the story could have been more fleshed out, and we might have seen an even stronger fight for Frank's humanity.
Yeah, to speak to Karen and Frank, we probably will cover Castle in one episode, so you'll probably have to set aside 2 hours for that one.
Oh.
Karen's relationship with Frank is one of the most gripping in the Netflix Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I would even argue that it is one of the most complex in the MCU, period.
Yes.
And we see this in season 1 when David talks about his wife Sarah. I know you mentioned this earlier, where he's like, Sarah's my home, Sarah's my family, and Frank immediately says, that's what Karen is for, Karen is the same for me. And this is in the context of Karen being in danger. And look, okay, I get it, we get it. Deb was out because of Daredevil season 3. But the gall, the audacity for Frank not to mention Karen once to Curtis or vice versa, it is a slap in the face, because if you watch season 1 or even Daredevil season 2, you know these two characters care a great deal for each other. Even if for some reason you're clowning and you say that they're not romantic, they obviously have a deep connection.
And their relationship.
Yeah, they are. Let's be real.
It's in the writing. They are.
It is in the writing. Just read it. Watch it, listen to it, feel it.
The Brett Mahoney of it all.
Yeah. Oh, okay, yeah. So that relationship is pivotal for them both because they push each other to be real. So we found that Karen stifles herself with characters like Matt Murdock, who, while he obviously cares about Karen and while they have this connection with each other, she herself calls him out on it in season 3, how she says that Matt sees her in this innocent light. Whereas with Frank, she is unapologetic, and she unapologetically pushes him to look for a life beyond the loneliness. I remember in season 1, I believe it's the scene where they're standing by the Brooklyn Bridge at night, and she's like, I want there to be an after for you. Yeah. Anyways, yeah. So
Castle episode. Here we go.
Castle episode. Welcome. That's just a nice little snippet for y'all. In addition to the severe lack of Castle, I would say that, again, because of the production and scheduling conflicts, the absence, I actually don't know if this had anything to do with scheduling conflicts.
I don't either.
But the absence of David Lieberman and his family was kind of insulting because they served an emotional core in the first season, and we see them achieve their happy ending at the end of season 1, but then in season 2 we get 0 mentions, 0, and there's not even a simple text message from Lieberman, and it feels wild because given how Frank depended on David/Micro last season, to gather intel, it just feels, especially now because they need more intelligence, that they don't even shoot him a text, shoot him a DM. And then beyond that, I would say that the show's avoidance of even really mentioning Foggy Nelson and Matt Murdock is kind of wonky too.
Especially
because,
Matt.
Yeah, they represented him legally, but Matt especially got on Frank's case a lot when he first appeared in Daredevil season 2. And there was just one mention of him, just one, and it's just not enough because we know that there is such a weight behind these relationships, and it feels like rather than doing the thing of where they could have woven Karen, David, Foggy, or Matt, they could have embedded them in organically, the writers and producers were nervous about even mentioning him or them because of how that might bring attention to maybe like the lack of them, but then it just ended up highlighting the fact that they weren't there. But because we as the audience know how important they are, as a result, it just feels like some of this season was hollow.
Yeah. They do this thing, and then this is in Daredevil season 3 too, where they'll just kind of like, if the character's not actively doing a cameo in the season, because we do have some overlap, then they'll like throw in their name once randomly. Like the Nelson and Murdoch drop was from Karen herself, and it's just so that she can get into the hospital. There's no like talking about Nelson or Murdoch from Brett, for example, who is a big role, a recurring role in season 2 of The Punisher, as maybe like trying to talk to them because they are his lawyers. However, we do know that backtracking. Yeah, they are. They should still be his lawyers because they're all working again as a firm together by this point. So it's very strange that no one's ever like, has Frank Castle contacted his lawyers yet? Or when Karen does show up, like it doesn't like, it's not important outside of that, I guess. It's very weird. They do that same thing in Daredevil where at the end of the season he's like name drops Jessica Jones and you're like, oh yeah, they're friends or whatever. Like, you like remember that out of nowhere. The disconnect for Frank and David and Frank and Matt was very stark to me outside of the Castle disconnect, because we definitely know that there's for a character as emotional as Frank, there's a lot there to work with, and it just seems like it doesn't make sense unless you think about these relationships as happening off screen. Which, what is your story then, right? We're hitting fanfic territory then. I definitely think that the season would have felt stronger had the writers not been restricted behind the scenes. We don't know everything that goes on, but the additions of these characters might have made the season truly phenomenal. I still think season 3 would make the story more complete, so #Save Punisher, you guys. Trend it. Yes. Let them know so we can get Disney to put the show on Hulu.
Yeah. So, wow. That's Netflix's The Punisher season 2. Overall, how would you rate it?
I would say a solid 3.8 out of 5 stars. Not a 4, but not like 3.5. The Pilgrim plot and the romance between Krista and Billy fell really flat. But overall, I still love the characters and I want to see them thrive. The cast is generally pretty fantastic. I think that the Marvel shows usually have a pretty great cast. There were some good sequences too, like the sheriff's office early in the season. And the writers did a great job connecting us to some minor characters, which is always a win. You?
I would say that it is a maybe slightly shaky 3.7 for me. Amy and Frank's relationship was one of my favorites to explore, though that might also be because I'm very soft for dad and daughter or mentor-mentee relationships. And I thought that the castle scene that we did get in the hospital in episode 11, even though it was super painful, it did an excellent job of illustrating just how much love exists between these two characters and how well they know each other. And there's just a lot of angst and a lot of tears from the characters and myself. Yeah, anyway, I agree with the sheriff sequence at the start of the season, and I really vibed with the sequence of Amy messing around in Dina's apartment, because I think that scenes like that do a really good job of establishing character. Yeah. And of course, the cast acted the hell out of themselves. Frank Castle, honestly, he is one of my favorite Marvel characters, so I'm very, very biased. He was my favorite part of season 2, so even getting an extra 2 seasons of this man was satisfying in its own way. But I really wish that they gave him that final upward arc that they gave Matt in season 3 of Daredevil, because he truly deserved to rise from this low. Anyway, hashtag save Punisher.
Thank you for joining us today. If you're listening on YouTube, we welcome discussion in the comments. Also, to reiterate, check out our socials. At that Beanery, at Breakfast Beanery, breakfastbeanery.tumblr.com, and of course, breakfastbeanery.com. Keep an eye out for updates to our website, as well as some behind-the-scenes content on our social media. And if you have any suggestions, feel free to email us at breakfastbeanerypodcast@gmail.com.
Yes, please suggest things, please, to editor Mika. Thank you for listening. Take care, and please, for the love of God, trend hashtag save Punisher. Bye.
Bye.